Hi, and welcome to Job Ready. I'm Jeff Nelder. I'm joined by my co-host, Charlie Nguyen. And today we have a really great conversation today with HD Chambers. HD, thanks for joining us today, first of all.
Well, I'm glad to be here. And if I had to be somewhere, this is where I'd want to be today.
Yes. So for those of you who don't know HD Chambers, he currently serves as the executive director of the Texas School Alliance. And prior to that, he served as public education for 37 years, including 17 years as a superintendent in the Stafford Municipal School District and the Alief Independent School District. But what we're going to talk about today is that HD is an innovator. He was a key architect and orchestrator of something called HB5. When I heard about this and the idea of greater connective tissue between high school and employment, I was fascinated, but it's rarefied information for some people. So HD, there's no better source of information than you. Can you ground us in the context of like what things were like when you created this so that, like we can start there and exactly what HB5 does?
You bet. And just to be clear, HB, so people that are listening to that, is not HD. It's HB as in boy. I get people used to call it HD5, and I said, no. It was the bill number. Just so people know, the 5 was the bill number in the Texas legislature. So just little really in the weeds context. No, so let's go back to 2011, 2012. And in Texas at that time, much like across the country, there was a sharp, a really sharp pointed conversation around what are our public schools doing to prepare kids for what our economy needs. And in some people's definition or their estimation, the economy needed more math and science majors coming out of our 4-year universities. They needed engineers. We were in this battle with India and the Pacific Rim about America not producing enough engineers to deal with the jobs and the responsibilities in our country. So you had companies, particularly in Texas, because we're such an oil and gas state and the petrochemical industry was so reliant on petroleum engineering, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering. So at the time in Texas, we had every student in high school, and I'm not exaggerating, guys. We had almost every student in our high schools expected to go to a 4-year university, expected to be very, very fluent, if you will, in higher level mathematics, algebra 2, pre-calculus, etc., which is the pathway that engineers typically take in high school and in the college. But and there was really no room for any other pathways that a high school student may be interested in. So I'm really making this, I'm simplifying this. It was obviously a much more difficult, convoluted discussion back then. But we in Texas, and in particular, a group of superintendents in the Houston area began thinking, wait a minute now, yes, there is a need. Absolute. There is a need for those skill sets and those individuals. Absolutely. But what brought it to my attention, what crystallized it in my eyes, was in my own district, in the Alief Independent School District in the West Houston area. We had about 50, mostly minority children, mostly coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And we're sitting around looking at our data about how many of our high school graduates were going to college, 2-year and 4-year, and what was the state average. And at the time, it was around 60%. The state average was around 60% of every high school grad was going to a 2 or 4-year school. And in Alief, we were patting ourselves on the back for kind of being right around or even slightly above the state average. And I just remember asking the question, okay, well, what about the other 40%? What are we as a royal we, I mean, the Alief we, but also as a royal, what are we doing? And so that led me to begin thinking about our legislature, the policies that were in place, the amount of the very prescriptive set of courses that our state was requiring kids to take, and not giving them an opportunity to take courses in areas in which, one, they may be interested, and two, by the way, our economy, our general population needs individuals that have credentials and certifications and skills that don't necessarily require a 4-year degree. So it wasn't that I was declaring war on 4-year degrees or declaring war on higher ed in general. I was trying to figure out how do we make high school a meaningful experience for these 40% or so of students who just, for whatever reason, are not going to college. And and that was the impetus. So I wrote a white paper in the fall of 2012. I should say myself and a couple of other superintendents, but I kind of took the lead on it. I'm kind of hard headed like that, and basically said if I were king for the day, I would create pathways. I would have multiple ways for students to graduate high school. I would have multiple ways for them to demonstrate that they are ready to move beyond the K-12 system. There are multiple ways to be prepared for the economy in which they're going to be thrown into, whether it's through a 4-year, 2-year, or into the workforce. And so through all kinds of political posturing and me going out as a evangelist, almost trying to talk people into supporting this. When I say people, I'm talking about parents. I'm talking about elected officials. I'm talking about pastors. I'm talking about all races. I mean, because we had pushback from the African American community and the Hispanic community, making sure that we weren't building a program that was going to target students based on their race into something that perhaps they had the ability and capability of doing something better or grander. But all of that little diatribe right there led to House Bill 5, a piece of legislation in 2003. And it essentially created 5 endorsement areas, 5 pathway areas for students to choose from. Things like STEM, business and industry, arts and humanities, general education. I mean, there were 5 different endorsements, if you will, that a student would take. And so that was the impetus behind all this. It was me trying to figure out how to create a pathway for that 40% that didn't really have a voice and didn't really have a place in our high school settings.
HD. So for the way most people think about credentials, essentially House Bill 5 foundation, should we say the foundation program is the best way to say it? Essentially what you did in my read is you turned high school into a place where you could say, I'm really interested in this career path. I'm going to take these classes and gain a, quasi certification in this endorsement area so that I can go out into the workforce immediately and work and get a job. Correct me if I'm wrong about how that works, but I mean, it feels like a simple, elegant way to do things. How did it work? Like, what was the impact?
Well, you're right. I mean, the way in my mind it would look, and I listen, I'm using, again, simplistic terms, but the way it would, in my mind, it worked, it would allow the students in our high schools, and let me back up just one second. The way the bill, and it's still in existence today, as we sit here today, the way the policy is written is that a 7th and an 8th grader, along with their counselor and their parents, and I know sometimes it all depends on the counselor and it all depends on the support of the parents, and I know that, but they, as a 7th or an 8th grader, would select the endorsement that they want to pursue in high school. The first thing people will say and think was, you mean you're asking a 14-year-old to decide what they're going to do? No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I raise my own children. I know hell, I was 14 at one time. I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow, much less next week. But what I did find is that 13 and 14 and 15-year-olds do have opinions, and they do know what they like at the time. Every one of us. Now, we may not be articulate enough, mature enough. We may not have the words to describe or the way to describe what we are interested in, but they do have opinions. And so if you could, part of my thinking is if you could get these kids hooked into whatever they're interested in. So let's say as a 14-year-old, you're interested in being a doctor. That's what you want to do. Well, you may never be a doctor. You may not like blood. You may not even have the skills to get through the grind of med school and all that. But at 14 years old, if that's what you're interested in, that's what's going to make you interested in school, much like extracurricular activities make kids interested in coming to school. So this was as much a way to get students hooked into, okay, maybe high school is more relevant for me. Maybe the young man who wants to go into auto mechanics or wants to go into HVAC or plumbing or you name the trade, maybe that student is going to be more engaged in their high school experience if they're actually taking courses and having experiences in that area. So yes, that was at least my way of thinking. Has it worked? Absolutely. No. Has it been perfect? No. We're 12 years out. This was 2013. This policy didn't really take effect until 2014, 15, and it started with the incoming ninth grade class. Because as you can imagine, the foundation school program, which was kind of the foundation of House Bill 5, that's the courses that every kid had to take. We just didn't give the Wild Wild West where your kids were taking whatever they wanted. You still had a core set of math, science, history, English, but these pathways that we opened up, along with our elected officials and our state board of education, they were designed so that kids, instead of just picking an elective that just happened to fit in their schedule, they were now taking electives along their endorsement or their pathway that in their freshman year would be like a principal's class, and their sophomore year. So there was a coherent sequence of courses that they would take in this area so that it was more meaningful. And yes, in some cases it led to a credential certification. In some cases it did not. It put them on the pathway to do that. But I'll end by saying this on this issue. What House Bill 5 did and continues to do now is it gave permission to the public school system, the higher ed system, in particular the community college 2-year systems, and the employers to come together and talk about things and actually enact curriculum, programs of study, etc., in a way in which was actually doable. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't a hodgepodge of elective courses kids were taking. They were actually meaningful courses. So if I want to go into auto tech, school districts could work with their local auto tech, their local automobile dealerships and their service managers. And if it's done anything, it has opened up the door in Texas to this bringing together these three kingdoms, the workforce, higher ed, and K-12, to talk about workforce, really meaningful workforce. And so that's where we are right now.
So I know Charlie is excited to ask you a question.
I committed the ultimate amateur sin of all, which is muted talk while it's muted. So, but I just gotta acknowledge it. AT, I absolutely love this concept, and I wish it was around when I was in high school. And I'm not going to tell you how long it's been since I've been in high school, because I was bored out of my mind, right? To the point that you talk about the rigidity of the curriculum, and it's just so boring. I tune out. Frankly, I would almost never in class when I was going to high school, and I have an 8th grader today. And so this topic is incredibly relevant and timely for me right now. Here's where I'm not so clear on when you talk about the 5 endorsement. 2 parts to my question. The first is, so you talk about 60% that's graduating high school, going on to college, right? And then the other 40%, I noticed in one of the endorsements is the trade, is the construction, it's a manufacturing, is the thinking there is that they continue to on some sort of kind of a post-secondary type of education, or they would go straight into an apprentice type of program and career as a result of it. So that's the first part. The second part that I want to dive a little bit into with you is, endorsement is such a powerful concept, but they only as strong as the employer relationships behind them, in my opinion. And I'd love to kind of dive into there with you a little bit more to understand that. So let me give you the space to answer the first part.
I guess the endorsement itself and what makes that a powerful tool to use or a powerful piece of policy for kids is because within the endorsement, there are certain pathways. So let's talk about the business and industry endorsement. That's the one that, by its own definition, it's the business, think about all the business courses that you can take in high school, accounting, entrepreneurship, etc. And the industry. Industry is code for the trades. That was kind of another topic for another day, but how we came up with these terms became very controversial. But the students that were bored out of their mind that you're talking about were typically the same students that when you put them in an auto tech environment or a welding environment or forensic science or architecture, you name it, CAD architecture, when you put them in there, they became valedictorians. They, one of the things that frustrated me a lot, and it still happens today, is when the general population says, you know what, that kid is smart. Well, they're typically referring to him or her being smart because they did really well on a test. They did really well on a PSAT, SAT, ACT, something like that. They went to an Ivy League school. They went to that's typically our definition of a smart person, not just a kid, a person. And then we tend to refer to the student who works on cars as good with their hands. Like they're good with their hands. They can be. And my argument was, or I don't know if my argument, but my thought was, how do I make the student who's quote unquote good with their hands feel like they're smart? And how do we in our education system reward, I don't know if that's the right word, but how do we incentivize them and recognize them for being smart because of the actions they're taking? And so the endorsements were a way, and the programs of study within those endorsements were a way for a student to demonstrate they were smart. And I'd literally, and I'm not kidding, when I was in A-Leaf, I told staff, I had 8,000 employees, I said, I don't want to use the term smart. If we're going to call a kid who's a valedictorian smart, we're also going to call the kid who could rebuild a V6 engine, tear it apart and rebuild it and make it get 40 miles to the gallon. They're smart too. And so it's things like that are attitudes, I guess, like that work. And you're right, to your point about the employer. The only way any of this works, quite frankly, the only way public education works is if we're doing things and producing a product. I don't mean to refer to a kid as a product, but for the sake of my illustration,
Yep.
if we're required for producing a product and the demand for this product is coming from the workforce, then by God, we need to be listening and talking to the workforce about what it is they need, what it is they want. They should have a little bit of say-so in helping write the curriculum for a course. And I'll give you a quick 15-second example. Along the Gulf Coast in the Houston area, petrochemical is a multi-billion-dollar industry. There's a position. It's called an instrumentation technician. All right. Don't get caught up in the words, but it's a very important position. You don't have to have a 4-year degree from any university. You don't have to be a math or science major, but there are certain math and science concepts that you must understand. If not, you blow up buildings and kill people. It's people's lives, and I'm not exaggerating. The people's lives are on the line based on this person making decisions about the instruments that are determining the chemicals that are going into the chemical plant, whether they're making polyurethane or plastic or whatever, oil and gas, you name it. Well, we had an instrument technician program, but you know what? We hadn't even talked to those people at DuPont or Dow Chemical or ExxonMobil or you name the company. And so the endorsements and the programs of study within the endorsements opened up the opportunity for people to come in, like HR people from petrochemical, and say, these are the skill sets we need for a young man or a young lady to be ready to go into the workforce. Maybe not straight out of high school, but we partnered to, Porter, your question, you would have to partner with your local community college. And all three of you, going back to my bringing these silos together, the K-12, the higher ed, in most cases, 2-year schools, and the worker, the employer, the workforce, had to come together to determine what it is that we need to be teaching in the K-12 system. How does that transfer to the higher ed system for community college? And ultimately, what does that look like when that young man or young lady is interviewing for a job and being asked to demonstrate, are you prepared for the skills that are necessary for this job? Take that one example and extrapolate that over every industry, every part of our economy. And that's what we were trying to do, was to build those bridges.
So this is fascinating. So the key question is, what kind of connective tissue did you create that you could scale across all of those areas? How does it work?
I'm not dodging the question, but it's going to depend.
Yeah.
So if you're in the Houston area, then the connective tissue is going to be the Greater Houston Partnership and Upskill Houston. Peter Beard, literally organizations like Upskill Houston in Houston, which is a body of the Chamber of Commerce that is designed solely to bridge the workforce gaps, to answer the questions about how do we get more plumbers out there? How do we get more electricians? How do we get more IT? I mean, you name the industry. It could be a trade, or it could be a very, very high, an education required kind of trade or profession. the best connective tissue in Houston is the upskill GHP, because they're the ones that are bringing all these different employers from different sectors of the economy into the same room with the K-12 and the higher ed. So in the Houston area, we've got a built-in convener, if you will, to work through the challenges. You go to Dallas, they've got an organization. It's a different name, but they do basically the same thing. And we found in Texas that these kinds of relationships between, I'm going to call them Chamber of Commerce's or Economic Development Corporations, these types of organizations bringing their members into a room with the higher ed folks and talking about what is possible, what is it, and going back to my point, those of us in academia, we are, one of our worst qualities is we think there's an academic answer to every freaking problem. In other words, the answer has to be in education somewhere. We got to be able to solve it with some. It's kind of like a math major. Every answer to every question, there's a math problem to it. I have long ditched that attitude about my profession. We need to listen to the employers. Going back to my product and what are we trying to create for them, and that is what's happening. And I've seen it across the state in large scale. To your question, when I say it depends on perhaps the region that you're in. What's the infrastructure within that region? If you're a small rural community in far West Texas or in the Panhandle of Texas, chances are you don't have a Chamber of Commerce. If you're incorporated, you have a mayor, maybe a city manager, and 5 city council members that are trying to keep their community moving and going forward. So it really depends on where you are, how sophisticated your infrastructure is, and that's it. In some cases, it's the last 12 years has produced unbelievable results in making sure kids are moving in a direction that actually will result in them having an opportunity to have a meaningful, at least start to their career. And I want to say something real quick. I meant to say this earlier. Jeff, you'd ask about trying to get some form of credential in a kid's hands leaving high school. I can tell you in the urban suburban areas, not just in Texas, this is across the country, college has become so unaffordable and so difficult to get admitted to get into. I mean, there's another episode on this by itself. Don't even get me started on higher ed. But what we found was I had to get students out working out of high school in not a minimum wage job, but a meaningful opportunity, even though that may not be their career, just so they could afford to go to Houston Community College. So before, we had to get off our academia pedestal and say, well, these kids need to go to college. Yeah, some of them really want to, they just can't get there. They can't afford it. So part of our thinking was using as much credentials and certifications as we could get a 17, 18-year-old, maybe 19-year-old kid, so they could leave us, start working, and then them be able to have the resources to go to college. And that's a real thing for a lot of people across the country, not just Texas.
HD, I want to dive into that topic of crushing student debt and affordability issue for college, because frankly, that's a topic that Jeff and I are incredibly passionate about. In fact, we founded a company with a simple mission to just reduce U.S. student debt. FI was founded on that premise, but we won't go into the self-promo of FI here, but we definitely want to dive into it. But before we go there, HD, I want to touch on something that I'm coming back to Houston. I'm coming back to Texas. And one of those reasons is because a bill that was passed last year that gives basically a school voucher to the family so that they can send kids to any public school instead of being tied to one specific school in the geographic area, right? Love to get your position on that. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I've done a little bit research about, from a TSA perspective, but I want to hear from your perspective, your thought on that, what you like about it, what don't you like about it.
Oh, I'll put my own words out there. Listen, I'm going to say this and then I'm going to clarify it. I think the education savings account, and for those that don't know what that is, it's basically a voucher that the state of Texas and other states, we're not the only one, but the state of Texas will provide taxpayer fund dollars to a parent for them to use for their child to go to a private school, parochial, private, regardless of what the affiliation is. In Texas, that dollar amount's $10,500 per student. If you're a special needs student, special education, you could get as much as $30,000, depending on the services your child may need. And if you're a homeschooler, which is one of the fastest growing demographic populations across the country, you could get $2,500. Excuse me, $2,000, not $2,500, $2,000. And so Texas passed this bill. I personally believe it may be the worst piece of education policy our legislature has ever passed. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that because I'm trying to protect the institution of public school. That's in fact, I'm not even close to being my motivation for feeling this way. I really do believe that the motivation behind this, the political motivation given was we want to help families find a school setting that most fits their belief system. Perhaps their public school has quote unquote failed their child. And I'm not arguing that does not happen. And I'm not, by no stretch am I arguing that parents should have the ability to have say-so in where their kids go to school. What I am saying is that the solution to the parental choice options and being able to have parents make these decisions should not include the taxpayers funding private institutions with no accountability, no financial accountability, no academic accountability. We're basically in Texas and other states, we've created another entitlement program that I just don't I don't, not why. I know why. There's politics and we can get into that if you want, but I understand why. I don't understand how there's a belief that this is going to improve the outcomes of the 5.5 million K-12 kids in our state right now. And I believe purely as a taxpayer, I am now paying, as a taxpayer, I'm paying for 3 different education systems in Texas. I'm paying for a public education system, just like we're talking about. I'm paying for a charter school institution, and now I'm going to be paying for a private school. And so if there's different ways to look at this. I am more concerned about the impact this is going to have on kids. I am, I'm just as concerned about the amount of money that the state of Texas is dedicating to this first year, which is $1 billion with a B, and how that $1 billion could have been used for a larger, significant number of students in our traditional public schools. So there's no secret. It's public. I've publicly testified. I'm not afraid of my position. Everyone knows it. So I just don't, but I don't want anyone to have any misunderstandings about why I feel the way I feel. I do not believe that public schools are the answer for 100% of every child's education, of their mental well-being or anything like that. I just have fundamental philosophical and professional differences of opinion on are private schools the best solution to that answer, and the way in which we're going to fund it, is that the best solution to that problem?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you talk about it, because I, at first being a former Texan and then now coming back to be a Texan again, when I read about it, on the surface, it sounds positive, right? Because if you are a part of a school district that's underperforming and now you have an opportunity to send your child to another school that's better performing, then it puts the kind of a free market component to it where, let the best product, thrive, if you will, on that piece. But to your concern is the quality, and there's no safeguarding that the other alternative options are as good, if not better, right?
Yeah, Charlie,
Based on your feedback.
No, I'll say this. I agree. If the system, and you can look at any state, Arizona, Indiana, Florida, Louisiana, there's a dozen or so states that are doing this. If the concern was the child you just mentioned, if the concern was the student who goes to school every day and their teachers are ignoring them, or the school is ignoring their problems, or the student is coming from an environment or experiences they can't overcome in our public school system, then I would say I would probably be less concerned. But we don't have any of those guards. This system is going to allow children who are already in private schools to benefit from this. It's going to allow, and I'm not exaggerating, there are parents who make $2 million a year that are going to be eligible to apply for them to get a subsidy, a $10,500 subsidy for their private school experience. So for those that support this and use the argument that we're trying to create a opportunity, much like you said, like kind of a free capital, and I'm 100% support of that. But if you're going to use that as not you personally, but if someone's going to use that as their argument, okay, use it, but it's got to be free capital to everyone. You can't let the private schools pick and choose who they're going to allow into their system. And that's what's going to happen. The term parental choice, the term parental choice, in this case, the parents don't have a choice. The schools have the choice. The private schools are going to decide, not the parents. And so that's my 5-minute debate, argument on why I don't like it.
That's awesome, HD. But so, coming back though to the foundation program, and we're big believers in pathways. We're big fans of Peter Beard's work, and what a great partner to have, and that he had in you as well. But let's say we're talking along the Gulf Coast and using as an example this instrumentation technician. Did I get that right? Instrumentation technician role.
Mm-hmm.
Opportunity for somebody to, have a meaningful life, meaningful lifestyle, a good solid job. Can you walk me through? There's the pathway, the endorsement pathway with a high school student, or high school students in the pathway. There's the Dow Chemical or whoever the employers are. You bring the right people at the employers, the HR teams, the learning officers, into a room with the schools, and they say, this is what we need your students to have. And then the students somehow learn, they come out and they get jobs. So for our audience, I want you guys all to picture this, across a variety of job roles that are remaining open right now. Cybersecurity is one that comes to mind really easily. How does it work from stem to stern? All the way up until these jobs, and then how does the system continue doing this?
You have to have willing participants. Again, and I'm going to go back to the employer. I believe the most important aspect of all of this is the role the employer plays, and what they're able to. When I say contribute, I don't mean in some cases, I mean financially support, like I said, course curriculum building, that kind of thing. But they also have to be willing at the end of this little journey that this student has, or this young adult has. They have to be willing and committed to giving them opportunities to go to work in their whether it's their specific company or in that field. There's a lot of examples, and I'm going to use one. I don't think you'll mind me using his company's name, but let's talk about electricians for a second. The data on the number of electricians leaving the field due to retirement, other reasons, is unbelievable across our country. That particular industry and that field is going to have an impact on economic development, because we're going to be building buildings faster than we can put electricity in. It's unbelievable. So in Texas, in the Houston area, there's an electrical company. They're mostly commercial electrical work, called Trio, TRIO. Their CEO, many years ago, when I was still superintendent, decided, I can't wait for the education system, i.e. K-12 and community college, and even the certification program of some union or some local, brotherhood of union electrical workers, because I can't wait that long. I need workers now. I need them now. So he literally created his own electrical curriculum. He began putting his own money into school systems, and it just so happened one of them was mine. And we created a course that started with 9th and 10th graders and 11th grader, and it worked its way up, where he was sending an electrician off of his own payroll to teach kids what he needed to have them know, so that when they ultimately got out of high school, and even before that, they were working as interns when they got to the right age, he was employing them. And if he didn't employ them, it's because they either demonstrated they hadn't mastered, the curriculum, if you will. They didn't pass the exams they had, or they just, the student chose not to go in that direction. So he's a company, very successful, who went out, and he, as we sit here today, he's probably in at least 25 or 30 school systems in Texas. With, at one point, he had 9 or almost 1,000 students in his electrical program being taught by his people, in some cases the school district staff. That's an example of how it started. The passage of this bill gave people permission and opportunities to work and create things like this so that high schools had the flexibility to offer it and students had the ability to participate in it. And so that's an example of a company, literally a company getting involved. And there's other examples. Like I said earlier, there's these petrochemical industries are doing this. Oil and gas is doing this. Hospitals. I'm going to tell you that we haven't talked about this, but healthcare, which by the way is the most popular industry for a high school student to choose. That is, when they choose endorsements, almost 2-to-1 high school students, middle school students choose some form of the medical field, not necessarily to be a doctor or a nurse, but to be a radiologist or a pharmacy technician or a phlebotomist, you name it. There's all kinds of jobs.
That's how your work came up originally, HD. We were talking with Houston Community College and the people leading workforce development at MD Anderson and Harris Health, right, Charlie?
Mhm.
And they were talking about, innovative ways that they solve the healthcare workforce crisis, which is huge. So I just want to say, yeah, you come up in those conversations as well, but sorry to interrupt. You keep going.
No,
Let's dive into the employer piece a little bit because I think it's very, timely and relevant here. We're seeing more and more of this, dots. I call dots like, and I'll give you what the meaning of a dot. For example, the news came out yesterday that Palantir, this huge software company, the founder said, forget about college. It's a waste of money. It's nothing but the indoctrinations of whatever. I'm not going to go into the political aspect of it. So he started a program to train grads from high school directly to work for his company. But he said, forget about higher ed badge or credential. All you need is 2 or 3 years of working for Palantir, and that is more than worthwhile, right? More than gold in terms of value. We're seeing more and more of those dots all around. Google had started their own program to train direct talent. They're emphasizing skill-based hiring. And so on one side, you see a lot of those activities going on because they're saying higher ed is not producing job-ready graduates for my need. On the other end of it, you have the crushing student that I won't name the school in Texas, but it's like $80,000-$90,000 a year of tuition. So if you think about if you graduate from just an average degree from that school, you're essentially $300,000 plus in debt upon graduation. Not too many parents can afford to write a check to pay that off, right? And so, and then on top of that, combined with the AI component that we're all living in today, where 6 months ago I couldn't code unless I have an offshore coder somewhere, and today I can tell you that I can vibe code instantly, right, using natural language. I'm too. So all of that coming back to your point about, employers. How do we get more of that? Look, I get it. Some folks will need a full 4-year and they go to college and they incur debt and they come out with tremendously high paying jobs. But there's so many more job roles, job families that frankly, you don't need to learn the history of whoever. You don't need to learn the various courses. I'm not saying they're not helpful, but you can get to your end result, which is getting to the workforce, be able to fill some of really critically areas that need qualified talent and not having a huge debt as a result of that.
Let's face it, higher ed, as a general rule, seems to be a 3 or 4 year experience for people to grow up. Now obviously there's some professions I want them to have a heavy dose of classroom experience. Like I want my doctors to, I want them to know what they're doing. I don't want them to learn on the job. I want my pilots, those kinds of things I understand. And there's no, earlier I made a little snarky comment about higher ed. We could talk about it. I think the employers in most professions have come to the conclusion that they would rather spend 2 or 3 years, spend literally the time and the money, training their own staff, coaching them up, specifically giving them the information they need, the skills they need, as opposed to going to some recruiting job fair at a university and hiring some kid walking off the stage with a 4-year degree. When you go back to your example of Palantir, or even my example with they just finally took it upon themselves. If the system itself wasn't going to produce what they needed, they were going to do it. And that's what capitalist companies do. That's what you do in our industry is if you're not getting solutions and answers from one deliverer, you go do something else or you don't survive. Well, one of the two. We're doing it in education now with teachers. We can't get anybody going to the teaching profession. So we're building benches of teachers from staff members that are already on the staff, and we're recruiting from other industries, and we're trying to give them an experience in teaching, much like a residency in the medical field, where you're there, you're doing the practice, you're actually involved. But so anyway, it's not just in the private sector; it's in the public sector. But back to my point on higher ed, I really think higher ed, notwithstanding the cost, but higher ed is going to have to reevaluate itself in the role it plays in our economy. Because if not, I see what Palantir is doing and what other companies have been doing for years. You mentioned Google. Long story, but I got a chance to do a study at Google 5 or 6 years ago, and they were they call them evangelists. They're the evangelists of human resources. Well, their HR team was talking about exactly what you're talking about. So we don't even hardly recruit. We may recruit engineers, someone who's got a specific set of skills that we have to have, but for everything else, we'd rather teach them. And we'd rather grab those kids out of high school, grab them 18, 20 years old and do our own training. And I think higher ed is going to have to change that. And I keep thinking that, and every year it seems like enrollment in higher ed goes up, tuition continues to go up, debt continues to go up, but it's going to take a structural societal change that's going to have to be led by the employer. It's got to be led by the business community, saying that we no longer are going to count on that as our sole source of employees.
But it can't be. It's not. I mean, well, because employers, regardless whatever industry that they're in, right? That's their core competency. So if you're in oil and gas, you know oil and gas. If you're upstream or downstream with oil and gas, if you're in the hospital business, you know the hospital, you know the care. I mean, there's core competency, and training isn't one that I'm aware of. And they're doing it out of necessity as opposed to that's what we're really good at, right? So, and that's the reason why it hasn't caught fire and spread across. And so I want to come back to your HB5 example here with this is higher ed essentially is that layer that allows the scalability across. But we've seen that statistically proven that grads coming out even 4-year program are not job ready. They and the turnover is upward of 60, 70% within the first year. I mean, that's horrendous, right? So we know that scalable layer of higher ed hasn't worked for a while now, and with incredibly crushing debt. Your example is a great one because you're developed the 5 endorsement, essentially that kind of that job ready layer adds more flexibility, adds more engagement, adds more early exposure to the student that it can then explore, various aspects when they're out of high school. So if you have to, two parts to this question, HD, what aspects of what you've done with HB do you think is applicable to the higher ed, right? To really, I mean, because again, some people are not meant to be for college degrees. A lot of them are. So what aspect of it is applicable? But I also want to come back and quantify the impact that HB5 has in the last 8 to 10 years or longer than 10 years in implementation.
The connection between K-12 and higher ed, when we were first putting this together, and I'm going all the way back to when I was just writing stuff on a piece of paper to when we were actually writing bill language, policy, to the actual implementation of it. I always had an assumption that higher ed was going to, 2 years in particular, 2-year schools, were going to have to be a part of this. They were the only way the credentialing and certification process would work was because a student would start something in high school. If they couldn't finish it or complete it for whatever the reason, because some credentials and certifications are not offered to a 17-year-old or 18-year-old, but whatever that was going to have to be completed by the local community college. So we haven't talked about this, but part of House Bill 5 included some requirements that K-12 systems and the higher ed partners work together to develop math courses, English literature courses that students were who were struggling coming out of high school, being successful in, and even in a 2-year school. So there was a lot of embedded safety nets, at least as I saw it, to try to help protect us. But to your question about the higher ed, I always presumed, because that's the way the structure of our employment systems work, short of your typical just weekend jobs or summer jobs. So the thread that held that together was, well, if and we'll give an example. It's the only way I can work. I have to give examples of this. So CenterPoint Energy. CenterPoint Energy provides all the electricity in the greater Houston area. Okay. They not only do they need electricians, but they need people that go out and build poles and build electrical structures and design them. They have an entire workforce of which most people are not electricians. It's kind of like in the medical field. Most of the people in the medical field are not doctors and nurses. They're everybody else that you're involved. With CenterPoint, we worked with Houston Community College and San Jacinto Community College on the east side of Harris County, our county. And we made sure that the alignment of our math courses that we were teaching. So let's think about Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2. We had a bunch of different level of math courses, but we wanted to make sure that the students who were taking these math courses under the foundation program were actually stair-stepping in a coherent, sequenced way into their first year of community college. And we wanted to make sure that course that they took in community college was going to ultimately finalize the credential or the certification they needed to go have an opportunity to work in whatever the field they were in. So that's kind of how, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's how we, at least in my mind and the way we built the policy, not just the policy, but the execution of it, that was how we tried to build it, was making sure our community colleges were a part of this. And to their credit, I mean, Houston Community College has over 100,000 students enrolled. San Jacinto, 55,000. I mean, these are big operations. To their credit, they literally began changing the way they identified the types of math courses that they were going to need for a student to be an instrument technician or to be a pharmaceutical technician or to go into electrical, whatever the field is. And we called them math ways, MATH ways, math ways. And we got away from this one size fits all math course. It again, going back to what I said earlier, there are many states that still do this. There are many school systems in Texas that still do this. But Algebra 2, the second level of algebra, in many cases was kind of a gatekeeper course that says, yes, if you do well in Algebra 2, you're going to be a lifelong success. If you don't do well in Algebra 2, get ready to live a minimum wage life. That's not true. It's not even close to being true. There are many different ways to demonstrate you're skilled in mathematics. Just doesn't have to be, A plus B equals C, that kind of thing. There's other ways. And so we built math courses to meet the needs of the employer, and in higher ed began forming their math ways to meet what we were doing in K-12. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but those things are in place right now that allows us to be really fluid and really flexible when the industry says, you know what, we're pivoting. We don't no longer need this. This is what we need now. AI being a part of that. Coding used to be a part of that. Hell, it's almost like coding was for a fleeting moment was what everyone needed and everybody wanted. Now nobody wants a coder. Like you said earlier, so now everyone wants people that can work with AI and be able to. So anyway, I hope that answered your question about the college presence in all of this.
Well, HD, I mean, we're coming up on the end of our time, but I've had a burning question for you. A lot of people might listen to this and go, wow, that's complex. I don't even know where to start with that. But it's not just Texas now, right? There are other states that have used your model. There's been notable success. Can you just tell our audience just kind of the top bullet points about, adoption, stats that indicate success to you so people know this is possible to do this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of states you mentioned, and a lot of states either modeled what they're doing after ours, or I did a lot of public speaking for a long time on how did you get this done in a red state that really was geared towards 4-year degrees, and higher ed had such a huge influence on our legislature. Here's my answer. This is not. I had a third grader tell me one time, He goes, Mr. Chambers, this ain't rocket surgery. And I started thinking about the whole rocket science brain surgery. I know. So what I'm getting ready to say is not rocket surgery. And I'm going to give little Michael Timpson credit for saying that. Anyway, here's my advice. If you're a state or a part of a state who's looking and you don't feel like you have done enough in this area of providing opportunities to meet the demands of the workforce, the first thing that needs to be done is the workforce has to come and be made aware of what are the constraints that are preventing you as a school system or as a state, depends on who I'm talking to here. But the workforce has to have their voice in this. We don't pass House Bill 5 in 2013 unless the business industry says, either give this to us or we're going to vote every one of you SOBs out. And that's about what they did. We had diehard Republicans, diehard supporters of the Republican Party, the governor at the time, Rick Perry, the lieutenant governor, David Dewars, who were literally telling them, if you guys don't pass something like this, we will no longer write you a check. We will find someone else. You get into some hardball politics, but that's kind of what had to happen in Texas. And it doesn't happen because HD Chambers said it. I didn't get that. They weren't reacting to me. They were reacting to these big players. So my first thing is I think you need to talk to your employers, tell them this is what's possible. And here's how I know it's possible, because it's being done in XYZ state. There are some states that are doing some really cool stuff in this. Georgia, Kentucky, there's Delaware of all places. There's some really good work being done in this arena. That would be my first thing. My second thing would be is you need to determine what are the demands that are being placed on your K-12 system, and how can you talk about academia now? How can you change what you're doing so that you can actually react to what the employer is getting ready to tell you? Because if you ask the employer and they tell you and you're not able to make a pivot to change, then you've kind of stuck a little pin in the relationship between the two institutions, if you will. And so that would be my second set of guidance. And my third set of guidance is you have to go talk to people that sometimes you don't typically talk to. I had to go, and again, when I did this, I didn't set out to do it. It just happened. I was persistent enough, had enough of an ego to not accept no every time we got told. So I had to go talk to people in groups that I really didn't feel comfortable being in front of. And I don't mean I was uncomfortable that I didn't trust what I was doing. I wanted to make sure that what I was telling them was the truth, and I had to believe in it. And if it didn't go the way I was thinking, then I'd have to be willing to come back and say, listen, I was wrong, or this was wrong. So you're going to have to, at least on the academic side, you're going to have to meet with people and have a relationship with groups and others that perhaps have been critical of you or perhaps disagree with you. And you're going to have to believe in your heart and your soul, and it's going to come across in your comments and your conversations that you believe this is the right thing. It just can't be an expedient political issue that you're only going to pay attention to for that moment. I've been after this since 2012. I believe in it. And even in my retirement, I'm doing things like this where I'm continuing to talk about it. So I guess those are my best answers.
One more question, and I'm dying to just ask you this question. And I think it's really relevant, and we've seen this. Soft skills, right? You talk about 5 endorsement for high school kids, and for some of them, when they graduate from high school, they will go into a trade program or a job, an apprenticeship. Where does soft skills or human skills, if you will, play into all of your focus during high school? Because we're seeing more and more of that become deficient, even at the college level. Would love to get you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. You asked something earlier where in my mind I said I need to touch on this, and I never did. So this trumps everything else. If you ask the employer, he says, I don't care how many skills the kid has. If they can't show up to work, they can't pass a drug test, or they can't work. It's the same soft skills have been in place since the beginning of time. In the bill itself, there wasn't a course, if you will, required to teach these kind of human relations, job related skills that the soft skills that you're referring to, that we all are aware of. However, it is the number one issue that comes up when districts begin recreating their curriculum. And for example, if every district now has a middle school course, that kind of a career exploration course, and they embed in that course soft skills starting at a very young age. Every course that's in a pathway, an endorsement pathway that a district offers, they are including soft skill tendencies, soft skill lessons in that course. I'm not going to say they are paying as much attention to that as they are the skills they're trying to teach, because sometimes it gets lost. But it is a very, very top of mind, very conscious level issue that we're wrestling with, and we continue to wrestle with. We have not solved that problem. Nope. No piece of policy is going to solve that problem. It's going to take, in my opinion, it's going to take employers working and being and this, I don't know how this is going to sound, but I don't want it to sound like I'm putting this all on the employers. But there's going to have to be a shared responsibility that the employer takes that helps guide and teach and giving that young man or young lady a chance to mature into their job so that they learn the importance of these soft skills. Solely counting on higher ed or the K-12 system or some academic setting to teach these and for them to stick, I think is unrealistic. I think it's 100% realistic to expect us to teach it and keep reminding and introduce these issues to students, and then ultimately as they become young adults. Absolutely, we're negligent if we're not talking about it and if we're not structurally including it in our conversations. But the employers are also going to have to, it's almost like passing the baton. Listen, we got HD about 20%. He'll show up. Here are the deficiency he has. He still is immature. He doesn't, all these things that maybe we've created this index of behaviors that a student demonstrates, not on the performance, not on the skills, not on the outcomes, but on their behavior, their workplace behavior. Maybe I think that needs to be passed along, just like the degree plan or the credential or certification, and the employer has to take some of that and bear some of that, and they do. But like in anything else, some is viewed as part of their responsibility, part of their onboarding, part of them trying to recruit and maintain and sustain a strong workforce. Some don't. Some don't have time for it. And like I said earlier, there are some professions I don't want them to train people on the job. I want that person operating on me, I want them to be 100,000% capable, competent. So
Kind of
anyway,
remind me of that commercial Motel 6, but I did stay at Motel 6 last night. Do you remember that commercial?
Yeah. Just because you did that doesn't mean I want you flying my airplane, that kind of thing.
Indeed. HD, you've been very generous with your time with us today, and we sure do appreciate talking with you. I've been so excited and looking forward to this. Thanks a lot for joining us.
You bet. I hope I lived up to your excitement. I hope I don't.
You sure did. And I hope we can ask you to join us again sometime. We parse this information and then we come up with follow-ups. I know Charlie well enough to be able to tell he's excited too.
Oh, I'm very excited.
I'd be glad to. There's a lot of things we didn't touch on that are important to this conversation. And to the extent you find me useful and valuable, I'll be glad to.